What we're talking about with this series is the idea that Jesus understands us. What we're talking about is the idea that Jesus gets us, that we're not so distant and far away from this person who was Jesus that we can't relate, that he can't relate to us or that we can't relate to him. And unfortunately, in the world we live in today, Jesus has gotten a bad rap in a lot of ways. And the one big area that breaks my heart about that is that Jesus has gotten a bad rap because we, his church, have not always done a very good job of representing who Jesus is. We've represented Jesus maybe as being aloof and away from humanity. Like, well, you can't really get him. I mean, he's Jesus, right? He's too high, he's too holy, so you can't really relate. Or maybe we've said, oh yeah, I follow Jesus, I try to live like Jesus does, and then we don't quite reflect the kind of life and values that Jesus lived and taught and preached. And so sometimes we give Jesus a bad name because we don't live like Jesus lived. That old 90s wristband bumper sticker phenomenon, remember? WWJD, you guys remember that? It was, what would Jesus do? And we're like, well, what would Jesus do? Well, he'd be nice. Yeah, but he didn't know my neighbor, okay? That guy's a jerk, right? Somehow in our minds we make that distinction that shouldn't really be there. So what we're going to do is we're going to look for a number of weeks at what it means that Jesus does get us. And we started last week with the idea that there are things that you can do. We have a little bit of a swag table over there. A lot of you already got shirts and got stickers. You've heard the challenge. We're going to repeat the challenge to you this week. But what I want to say is if this is your church home and you know Jesus, these next several weeks is a great opportunity to invite somebody here that you know who doesn't know the real Jesus, who doesn't know the Jesus of the Bible, the Jesus that has impacted and changed our lives. Because we're going to talk about how relatable Jesus is. Now, that doesn't mean that Jesus isn't holy. That doesn't mean that he is not literally the Son of God. And in that aspect, completely beyond our imaginations. But the truth of Scripture is that he's also 100% completely without reservation human, and he gets us. And we're going to talk about how we can connect with, as what the Bible tells us in Hebrews 4. We read that, for we do not have a high priest, Jesus, who was unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Hebrews 4, the author of Hebrews, lets us know that Jesus gets us. So for the next several weeks, again, church family, invite friends that maybe don't know who Jesus is. And if you're here now and you're like, I'm not really sure who this Jesus is. I saw some of those ads on TV and YouTube, and man, I just wanted to check it out. I wanted to find out who Jesus is. Well, we're going to find out today that Jesus gets us because Jesus suffered like we suffered. Do you understand that? Jesus suffered, not just in this abstract, intellectual, philosophical way, but in real, tangible, down-to-earth ways that he understands, because Hebrews 13:12 tells us this. So Jesus also suffered outside the gate of Jerusalem, in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. See, what Jesus did was done with a purpose. His suffering, and what we can find out is even our suffering, does not have to be divorced from purpose. Now, that doesn't mean that it makes it okay. It doesn't mean that it makes our suffering good. But it means that God can use all things, because through Jesus, God has made all the broken able to be healed. That's what we can tap into. That's what we can step into. Look with me, if you don't mind. In your Bibles, there's the Old Testament and the New Testament, if you're not familiar. The Old Testament's about 2/3. It's the bigger section. It was written earlier. It was the Jewish scriptures, out of which flowed the New Testament. And that's where we get our parts of the Bible that talk specifically about Jesus. In the Old Testament, we have a book called Isaiah. Isaiah was a prophet. He proclaimed God's will, God's truth, to God's people and then the surrounding world. And in Isaiah, we have some of the most remarkable, beautiful, amazing prophecies that point hundreds of years earlier than the events that happened to who Jesus was and what he did. One of those we find in Isaiah chapter 53. So if you've got your Bibles, if you've got your apps, flip there. We're going to look at the beginning of Isaiah 53 for just a few moments. See, what we read here in Isaiah 53, starting in verse 3, is he, and this is referring to Jesus, was despised and rejected by men. Did you catch that? He was despised and rejected. He was a man of sorrows and acquainted, he was familiar with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Now there's an Old Testament referent that this points to, but ultimately this is pointing us to who Jesus was, what it would be like when Jesus was here. And how would you like this to be when you shuffle off this mortal coil and they put that nice stone at the end of the place where your body was? If they wrote this inscription, he was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. What would you like that to be your gravestone? Any takers on that? Real morbid, yeah, of course, if you're in the room, you know that Tiffany would be the one to raise her hand for that. If you don't know Tiffany, run. She's no, Tiffany is wonderful. But honestly, none of us would want that to be described. Hey, here's the summation of your life. You are despised, right? We know that would be a terrible thing. Yet Jesus, what the Bible teaches is the Son of God who took on the flesh of humanity and became fully human, that fully God, fully man come together. On his epitaph, it says he was despised by those he came to love. He was rejected by those he came to love. Jesus suffered. What I want us to look at is what continues in Isaiah 53, because what we see is that Jesus' suffering was not without purpose. We read in verse 4 here. He says, surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. And with his wounds, we are healed. Do you catch that? All the suffering, all the despising, all the sorrows, all the rejection, all of that Jesus bore. He walked through that for a purpose. What was his purpose, church? What? To save us, to redeem us, to heal us, to bring health and wholeness and put back togetherness into our brokenness. Jesus was willing to walk through suffering not because he was some kind of weird, masochistic person who wanted suffering. He bore that as a cloak. He put it on. He shouldered it because he knew if he did what he could do for others. It is the most quintessential definition of love that he put the good of those other than himself before his own good. He bore it for someone else, not because someone else deserved it, but simply because we are cherished by the God of all creation. That's what Jesus did. And for us to understand why it matters that Jesus suffered and why it matters that he gets us because of it, we have to start with this big idea. All of our lives are marked by struggle. All of our lives are marked by struggle. If you think you're not struggling, you are confused, okay? We do struggle, whether or not we always recognize it in the moment. Now, that doesn't mean that you are always struggling as much as you possibly could, because there are people who think that every ounce of their life is this like unbearable struggle. You don't know what it's like. We have to step back a little bit, especially in our context. In America, our worst struggles pale in comparison to the struggles around the globe. So we do have to take a little bite of humble pie. Okay, when I'm complaining about the high rate, the high cost of some health insurance stuff, the fact of the matter is I have access to health care that would result in people in another country, another part of the world dying. Okay, so we take a bit of humble pie. Yes, there are struggles, and I'm not saying they're not real, but we have to make sure that we're not having this, I struggle more than everyone else. You can't possibly understand my struggle. Okay, but our lives are marked by struggle. And this, I would say, is affirmed by the Bible. Let's look at Romans. This is a book that the Apostle Paul, one of the early followers and leaders in the Christian church, wrote to Christians who were in the area of Rome. And he's explaining, in Romans is an incredibly rich book in so many ways. It's a letter written to these people, but it's deeply theological. And he says this in chapter 8, verse 18. He says, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us." See, as he begins explaining some of the rich theology that he's about to talk about, he starts with the presupposition that in this present time, there is what? What is there? Suffering. It's not like convincing them, okay, guys, I need you to understand things might be bad right now. It's, well, guys, you know that suffering is going on. This has been happening throughout the human condition. And now, this is not going to be a full treatment of this, but I want to suggest just a few things. First of all, that sometimes suffering is the consequence of our own sin. Are we aware of that? That I can do dumb things that produce dumb results, right? Okay? You know all the phrases that go along with that kind of thinking, but we get it. If we do dumb stuff's going to happen. Sometimes our suffering is our own fault, and it's so funny because in my world, what I can watch is that so often when that is the case is when people kick the hardest against those consequences. We'll just rage, I can't believe this is happening, and I want to step back and be like, you know this is your fault, right? I mean, I don't do that. I try to do the nice pastor thing, not make them feel bad. But this happens a lot. Now, I'm not trying to say this is all the time, but I'm saying this is a real thing. Sometimes it's because of the sin of others. If you haven't realized that, I mean, you can even do this exercise. And humor me. Look to the person on that side of you. Just look at them. Christina, you're not looking at him. Christina, there we go. Okay. She had a squirrel moment. It's okay. Now look at the person on that side of you. All right, there you go. So if there was a human being beside you, that person is a sinner. Were you aware of that? Okay? I know some of you are acting shocked that someone would consider you a sinner. Come on, don't look at me like that. No, we are all sinners. We have all screwed up. We have all messed up, and our sin doesn't affect only us. I know one of the things when you're talking about different topics, especially hot topics in the world around us, is the idea that, well, this is a victimless crime, or if you're in Christian circles or religious circles, they'll say this is a victimless sin. I want to suggest that there is no such thing. Everything we do, even if I think it's private and secret, will have an effect in one way or another on those around me. Because we are communal, we are built and designed to be in community. Sometimes it's simply because we live in a broken world. Okay? Sometimes suffering happens. We're all in this suffering because the world around us doesn't work the way it's supposed to. Things have fallen apart from God's original design. And lastly, it's not necessarily that it's a causal, but it comes alongside of, it's a kind of a corollary, is the idea that sometimes God will use suffering in order to grow us and move us where he wants us to be, what is best for us. And I can tell you that even in some of the situations of my life, whether it was consequences of my own sin or the consequences of sins of others where things brought suffering, on the other side of that brought joy and purpose and experience that I never would have had that have been used in mighty ways on the other side of it. It doesn't make walking through it any less stinky, but it gives us perspective and helps us move to the other side, knowing that God can use even that. But it wasn't just Paul talking about this. Let's look and see what Jesus says. In the book of John, he says this in chapter 16 of that gospel account. He says, I have said these things to you that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have peaches and cream, strawberry fields forever. Right? That's what that says. Right? That's what we wanted to say, but it says in this world you will have tribulation. Not like inconvenience. It does no good to deny the suffering that we face. It just doesn't. Whether it's physical, mental, financial, relational, spiritual, vocational, emotional, any of those areas. We can't deny it. Just say, well, it doesn't happen. It doesn't exist. It's not that bad. Or, feeling like we should say that because we're Christians, right? If you've chosen to follow God, nothing should ever make you sad, right? Because you have the joy of the Lord. So everything makes you happy and smile. Right? Anybody like that? If so, I want whatever it is you're taking to get you there, because that ain't real. Okay? It's not. The fact of the matter is there is real suffering. But, and we're going to circle back to this at the very end. Look what Jesus says. Even though he says that in this world you have tribulation, before that he says he has said these things that we may have peace. This idea of hearkening back to the Jewish idea of shalom, which is not just stopping of war. That's how we think of it. We think of it as war and peace, right? You're either shooting guns at each other or you have international treaties. That's just kind of what we think of in that regards. But the reality is this shalom is deeper, it's richer, it's broader. It's a wholeness of life being settled into the core of what we were designed to be. It's all the brokenness being set back into place. Like a broken bone mending the way it was supposed to be originally. That's what this Jesus is saying. This is why I've told you this. And then he says, though I've told you this that you may have this, I recognize that tribulation, real suffering is going to happen. And then he says, but take heart, there's a truth. He says, I've overcome the world. Now, is sin gone? No. Here's the thing. Jesus has brought victory over sin, but sin has not ultimately been defeated yet. It still runs its course. And Jesus promises in his word, when we read about throughout the course of our Bible, that there is an ultimate fulfillment that we will one day be able to enjoy and step into, where sin and death and disease and brokenness and all of the chaotic pieces that break apart our world will be set right. But in between, we're told this beautiful truth that Jesus has overcome. And what it means to follow Jesus is to step into that overcoming. It is a process, it takes time, and it takes not just us on ourselves, just me and my Bible against the world. It takes God's family coming together and doing this in community. But it is a promise that brings such hope if we understand it. Now, before we move past this point of understanding that all of our lives have been marked by suffering, I want to share something from a pastor and theologian. He's recently passed away. His name's Eugene Peterson. He wrote this: we, those who follow after Jesus, are able to face, acknowledge, accept, and live through suffering because we know that it can never be ultimate. It can never constitute the bottom line. God is at the foundation and at the boundaries. He seeks the hurt, maimed, wandering, and lost. God woos the rebellious and the confused. If God were different than he is, not one of us would have a leg to stand on, but because of his forgiveness, we do have a place to stand. We stand in confident awe before God, not in terrorized despair. See, though this world is broken and though we all face suffering, there is hope. Hope in the promise of who Jesus is, what he did, and what he has said is yet to come that revolutionizes the struggle we walk through. And that takes me to our next big idea. And that is that Jesus entered into our world of struggle. He didn't sit back. And we've already looked at this in Isaiah 53. We stepped into that. See, we face suffering in this present time, for sure. But Jesus did too. We face division, dishonesty, things like divorce, mistrust. The list goes on and on and on of the struggles that we face. But the truth of the matter is that Jesus walked through the sufferings of this world as well. Not in an aloof, up on a mountainside, observing what creation was doing, but in the muck and the mire alongside of us. If we go to 1 Peter, and in 1 Peter, I think it's like 15 times, if I'm remembering correctly, the word suffer or suffering shows up in that book. 1 Peter talks a lot about suffering and how that intersects our lives and how Jesus intersects that suffering. But in 1 Peter 3 and verse 18, we read this: for Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit. Look at those first words. Christ also suffered. Christ suffered. He walked through it. He is not aloof from it. God did not leave us alone in our struggles. Jesus came and he walked among us and he touched the broken and the diseased. He suffered hunger, rejection, pain, thirst. He experienced struggles like we all do. In Samaria, he experienced hunger and thirst. When he was on the cross, he said, "I'm thirsty." After the cross, even after that glorious resurrection, he was so human that even at that point, when he talked to his disciples, when he was among them, he said, "Give me some fish, I'm hungry." Okay? Jesus experienced all those things that we experienced. And like we saw in Isaiah 53, he endured great, and if we could even say inhuman suffering that he did nothing to deserve. Christ also suffered. Now look here in Acts 3, also verse 18. It says, what God foretold, and this is Peter explaining who Jesus is, what God foretold by the mouth of all the prophets, that his Christ would, what? Suffer. From the very beginning, it was known, God knew that he would have to bear the suffering of his creation, the suffering that his creation created. And so in what Christ did, this picture of the cross, what we celebrate at Easter, what we'll, in beginning of April, we will dedicate time to again celebrating what Christ accomplished in the cross, he fulfilled through his suffering. It wasn't just accidental. It wasn't just like, well, I guess it happened along the way of what he was doing. It was woven in that Jesus would have to bear what we created. And so that leads us to, in my mind, our kind of last point here. And that is that Jesus struggled to exchange our struggle with abundant life. He didn't just come in and do his thing and then leave and say, good luck, people. What he said was, I have come, what we're going to read in just a moment, that you may have life and have it to the full. Go to John chapter 10. This is kind of our last little place here where we're going to look this morning. But in John chapter 10 and verses 10 and 11, here's what we read. It is a powerful, powerful statement. Starts with the idea of the thief. And do you know who the thief is? In the Hebrew, it would be Hasatan. It would be the accuser, the Satan, the one who is against us, the adversary. We call him the devil or Satan. Right? These are names that we find in Scripture. And one of the really unique things about this enemy that we have is he's never actually really given a proper name. Do you know that? Where we see Satan, especially in the Old Testament, it's Hasatan. It's the accuser. These are titles of descriptions of what he does. He's the father of lies, right? So it's like the Bible doesn't even want to dignify him with an actual name. Even Lucifer, that's not the actual name. It's transliteration of Latin and stuff like that. All of these are descriptions of what he does to fight against the one who has all the glory. This thief, the one who would take from the one who rightfully owns it. Says a thief comes only to do some pretty nasty stuff. Steal, kill, and destroy. On the contrary, Jesus here speaking says, I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. This is really, really interesting. I don't want to go too geeky egghead on you, but again, just tapping back into the fact that we understand that the New Testament, the Bible that we're reading here in the Gospel of John, it was written originally in the Greek language. And when you read the word life in the New Testament, typically it is either the Greek word bios or zoe. That, bios is more biological life, zoe is more ethereal. It's neither of those words here. It's suke. It's where we actually get the preface to something we, in our American language or English language, call psychology. It's where we also, other places, it is translated as soul or spirit. It is the deep sense, the core of everything that makes up a person. It is broad and it is deep. It is not just so that you never stub your toe again. And it's not even just so that you may have an eternal indwelling spirit. It's not merely one of those two. It is both of that and so much more, this life that God is talking about. This life that Jesus points to, and he says, you will have this life. It will be yours. That's why I've come. And he says, abundantly, above and beyond what you need. That doesn't mean that Jesus says, well, if you trust in me, you will have all the money you could ever dream of. You'll have all the trappings, all the bling that you could ever imagine. That's not what Jesus is saying. He's not saying that your kids will always listen to everything you say. He's not saying your spouse or your partner will always agree with you because obviously you will always be right. That's not what Jesus is saying. He's saying the quality will be deep and rich and abiding. It's that idea of shalom, that peace that Jesus brings. That's why he says these things, that we may have this rich, deep, abundant life. But the thing is, so often we as evangelicals, and that's a term that, it's kind of weird and gooey and can apply in different places. But broadly speaking, we evangelicals have taken this idea of the Christian life and boiled it down to this notion. And it's, I am here only to preserve my spot in this heavenly realm that will happen after my body dies. That somehow the wholeness of what Jesus brought is eventually this gets to die and I get to be free. I want you to know that is actually a heresy, and it goes back to some of the Greek Gnosticism and things like that. That was imposed over the years on Christianity. The idea of heaven, of life eternal, is both physical, material, and spiritual, okay? Non-material, immaterial, but it is for today and ultimately in the future. The abundant life we should be bringing, we should be fostering, we should be pouring into for ourselves and others, even now, today. It's one of the reasons why we say we value community impact, because we want to take the love, the grace, the truth of God that we have here, the joy that we have, and just flood our community with it. Because that's what Jesus did. Jesus came down. He tabernacled, it says at the beginning of John. He took on the flesh of humanity in order to love the world. He didn't need to. He was good on his own. But he said, I love you and I will do everything to make everything right for you. He incarnated himself into our world, into our suffering to relieve suffering. And that's what we're called to do now. And if we look here, it says in verse 11, I am the good shepherd. Jesus says, the good shepherd does what? Lays down his life for the sheep. Jesus is the good shepherd, the one who cares for all those who will follow after him. And he sets us an example that we put others first. And I know that is hard. It is so hard to say, your good is more important than my own. Now, if we step far enough back, we understand in a community, if everyone does that, then everyone's needs are always met. But it's so hard to step back and say, wow, that's the beautiful heaven on earth creation that God is calling us to. And we zero into my life. But if I care about them, what about me? What about my needs? And I get stuck here, where God is trying to give us the perspective, stepping back, of his kingdom here on earth. That's what we're called. That's what we're called to replicate. That's the abundant life that we're called into. And that means this as a final point. And I'm glad that you can see on the screen so I don't have to say it 14 times to make sure that you get it. Following Jesus doesn't mean struggles disappear, but that we can flourish in spite of them. Did you catch that? Following Jesus doesn't make it disappear. And we're going to wrap up in just a second. Our team's going to come back up. We're going to sing another song in just a few moments. But I want you to lock this into your brain. Because if you've been following Jesus for a while and maybe you're frustrated because things aren't always working the way you want. Well, that's the thing, is God never promised that all your problems would disappear. But he promised that he would be there with you in the middle of them. And if you're at the point where you haven't chosen to follow Jesus, where you're not sure about this Jesus guy yet, we don't want to give you some kind of false picture that there's these magic words you can say and then everything magically works. You never stub your toe. You never get a speeding ticket. You can drive as fast as you want, and you'll never get a speeding ticket. There's no magic Jesus potion that you take. But what you do get when you recognize who Jesus is and accept the love that he wants to offer, forgiveness that he has laid bare, that he has paid for, is you get freedom. You get someone who will walk with you through the darkest depths, the darkest valleys that you could ever walk through. And the thing is, I know some of you have walked through that because, you've invited me into the journey with you on that. And the thing is, that's what Jesus is offering to each and every one of us. That's how Jesus does get us, because he walked through those. And he offers now to walk hand in hand with us. Now, what we did say last week and for the last several weeks, that we want to be this year as a church family resolved. We say that it's more than just, kind of gently agreeing with what it means to love our neighbors, to be here for our community. These values, these beliefs, the purpose that God has given us to help people live Jesus-centered lives, and to do that by connecting them to the help and the hope and the healing of Jesus. That's not just a slogan that we can slap on a wall and say, look, that's good. We have to be resolved to do the work, both as a whole church family and as individuals, to make that happen. That's why last week we started with the challenge. That's why we have our swag table over there. We still have some shirts left. So if you didn't get shirts last week, we invite you to go over there. Some of the sizes have been picked through. If your size isn't there, I can get you the website so that you as an individual can order one of your the size for you, the size that you need. We can go over there and grab one of those. And what we're saying is, hey, over the next 3 weeks, one time each week, wear that shirt where someone's going to see you. So you can start a conversation of, what does it mean that God gets us? Or what does it mean that Jesus was a refugee? Did you know that was true? We talked about that last week, that Jesus, he lost his home and he had to go somewhere else. He understands what that's like. Okay? We also have stickers over there. We're asking you to put them on a place where people will see them. My Vitara got a new sticker this week. And so I actually put that on our Grace family page, our Facebook group. So you can go ahead and take a picture where you put yours and share that there, so we can show each other where we're putting them and give ideas to each other. But I'm encouraging you to do that so that other people can ask questions about this Jesus who does get us. And the last two things, first of all, host a dinner over the next 3 weeks and invite somebody who might not know who Jesus is to sit down in your house with you over a meal. And lastly, you've got 3 weeks. We're asking you to invite people who don't know Jesus, to come and find out a little bit more about what it means that Jesus does get us. That this God of all creation would take on human flesh and do everything so that we could come back to him. That's the challenge. I encourage you to push into that. Don't make it a challenge that might be good for somebody else, but you've got other things on your plate. Don't make that excuse. Let's all do it.